Vicksburg, 1863. The siege that decided the Civil War, May 18, 1863, dawned with Union General Ulysses S. Grant poised to make history. How did a city's fate hang on a river's bend? Why did two armies clash in a struggle that would echo through the ages? What drove men to endure 47 days of relentless siege, where hunger gnawed and hope flickered? Join us as we unravel the epic tale of Vicksburg, where tactics clashed, lives hung in the balance, and a nation's destiny was forged in fire. In early 1863, the Union Army, under the command of Major General Ulysses S. Grant, was determined to capture the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. This city, perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, was known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy due to its strategic importance. Controlling Vicksburg would give the Union full command of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and cutting off vital supplies and communication lines to the western Confederate states. Grant's first attempts to take Vicksburg were direct and aggressive. In late April and early May, Union forces launched several frontal assaults on the Confederate defenses surrounding the city. However, these initial attacks met with disaster. The terrain was difficult. Thick woods, steep ravines, and fortified Confederate positions made a direct assault nearly impossible. Confederate forces, under the command of Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, were well prepared and fiercely defended their positions. The Union soldiers, despite their determination, were met with a hail of gunfire and artillery. The Confederate defenses, entrenched on the high bluffs, had a commanding view of the battlefield, making it easy to repel the Union assaults. Union forces suffered heavy casualties and, despite their bravery, were forced to retreat. After these costly failures, Grant realized that a direct assault would not succeed. He needed a new strategy, one that would bypass the heavily fortified city and cut off its supply lines. Frustrated but undeterred, Grant devised a bold plan that would ultimately lead to the fall of Vicksburg. Grant decided to move his army south along the west bank of the Mississippi River, away from the heavily defended approaches to Vicksburg. This was a risky maneuver. Grant's men would have to march through difficult terrain, and they would be separated from their supply lines. But the gamble was calculated. Grant's plan was to cross the Mississippi River below Vicksburg, where the Confederate defenses were weaker, and then strike northward to approach the city from the east, cutting off all avenues of escape and reinforcement. On April 29, 1863, the Union fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, launched a diversionary attack on the Confederate fortifications at Grand Gulf, located south of Vicksburg. While this attack failed to capture the fort, it successfully diverted Confederate attention from Grant's main force, which was secretly moving south. On the night of April 30th, Grant made his move. Using Porter's gunboats to protect the crossing, the Union Army began crossing the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg, a small hamlet south of Vicksburg. This was the largest amphibious operation in American military history up to that time, with over 20,000 soldiers ferried across the river in just one night. The crossing was a remarkable feat of logistics and coordination, and it caught the Confederates completely off guard. Once across the river, Grant's army quickly began its northward march. The Union forces moved with incredible speed and secrecy, bypassing the Confederate defenses at Grand Gulf and heading directly towards the interior of Mississippi. Grant's strategy was to cut off Vicksburg from the rest of the Confederacy by seizing the key railroads and supply routes that connected the city to other Confederate strongholds. The first major engagement of this campaign occurred at Port Gibson on May 1, 1863. Here, Confederate forces, commanded by Brigadier General John S. Bowen, attempted to stop Grant's advance. The battle took place in the dense, rugged terrain of southwestern Mississippi, with Union forces advancing through thick woods and ravines. Despite the challenging terrain, Grant's troops fought with determination. The battle was intense, with Union forces making repeated assaults on the Confederate positions. The Confederates fought valiantly, but were ultimately outnumbered and outmaneuvered. By the end of the day, the Confederates were forced to retreat, leaving the road to Vicksburg open. The victory at Port Gibson was crucial for the Union. It secured Grant's foothold on the eastern side of the Mississippi River and allowed him to continue his northward march. The Confederate forces were now in disarray, and Grant was able to press his advantage. After Port Gibson, Grant's army continued its rapid advance northward, moving deeper into Mississippi. The Union forces moved with such speed that the Confederates had little time to regroup or mount a coordinated defense. Grant's strategy was to keep the pressure on the Confederates, giving them no time to recover or reinforce Vicksburg. The next significant battle took place at Raymond on May 12, 1863. Here, Union forces under Major General James B. McPherson encountered a smaller Confederate force commanded by Brigadier General John Gregg. The battle was fierce, with Union troops pushing through the town of Raymond and driving the Confederates back. Despite being outnumbered, the Confederates fought tenaciously, but they were eventually forced to retreat. The victory at Raymond was another important step in Grant's campaign. It disrupted the Confederate communications and further isolated Vicksburg. With the Confederates in retreat, Grant was now able to move his army towards the vital railroad junction at Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. On May 14, 1863, Grant's forces captured Jackson, Mississippi, after a brief but intense battle. Jackson was a key strategic point, serving as a major supply depot and railroad hub for the Confederacy. By capturing Jackson, Grant effectively cut off Vicksburg from reinforcements and supplies from the east. The fall of Jackson was a significant blow to the Confederacy. It not only deprived the Confederates of a vital supply line, but also demoralized their forces. Pemberton, who was still holding Vicksburg, was now completely isolated. The Confederate forces were scattered and unable to mount a coordinated defense. After securing Jackson, Grant turned his attention back to Vicksburg. He moved his forces westward, approaching the city from the east. The Confederates, now fully aware of Grant's intentions, rushed to fortify their positions, but it was too late. Grant's army was closing in, and Vicksburg was surrounded. The siege of Vicksburg began in earnest on May 18, 1863. When General Ulysses S. Grant's Union forces, numbering over 77,000 men, encircled the city of Vicksburg. Grant, understanding the strategic importance of Vicksburg as the key to controlling the Mississippi River, was determined to capture it. On May 19th, he ordered a direct assault on the Confederate defenses. The Union soldiers, weary from weeks of marching and fighting, advanced under a hot sun. They were met with fierce resistance from the Confederate defenders, who had fortified their positions with trenches, earthworks, and abatis, barriers of felled trees. Brigadier General Stephen D. Lee, a Confederate officer, directed the defense with steely resolve. The Union soldiers faced a hail of bullets and artillery fire as they struggled to breach the Confederate lines. Despite their bravery, including acts like those of Colonel Giles A. Smith, who led his men with determination despite being wounded, the attack was repelled with heavy casualties. Grant's forces were forced to pull back, having achieved little. Undeterred by the failure of May 19th, Grant ordered another assault on May 22nd. This time, the attack was better coordinated, with simultaneous assaults planned across several points of the Confederate lines. The Union soldiers were again met with devastating resistance. The Confederate forces, commanded by Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, were well prepared and determined to defend Vicksburg to the last man. Among the Confederate ranks, men like Private William Watson of the 46th Mississippi Infantry fought valiantly, knowing that Vicksburg was crucial to the Confederate war effort. The Union forces again suffered heavy losses. One particularly bloody engagement took place at the Stockade Redan, where Union soldiers, led by Brigadier General Francis P. Blair, Jr., reached the parapet but were unable to hold their ground. The assault was a failure, and Grant realized that a different approach was needed. After the failed assaults, Grant decided to settle in for a siege. His strategy was to encircle the city completely, cut off supplies, and slowly tighten the noose around Vicksburg. The Union soldiers began digging trenches, moving closer to the Confederate lines each day. The conditions were harsh. Heat, disease, and constant sniper fire took their toll on the men. Yet the Union forces pressed on, their resolve unbroken. Grant's engineers, under the direction of Captain Andrew Hickenlooper, devised a plan to undermine the Confederate defenses. They began digging mines beneath the Confederate lines, intending to plant explosives and create breaches. It was a slow and dangerous process, with the men working in cramped, dark tunnels under constant threat of discovery. On June 25th, the Union engineers completed their most ambitious mine. They packed it with nearly 2,200 pounds of gunpowder and waited. At 3:30 p.m., the mine was detonated. The explosion was massive, sending dirt, debris, and Confederate soldiers flying into the air. A large crater was left where the Confederate defenses had once stood. Seeing the breach, Grant ordered an immediate assault. Union soldiers, including the 45th Illinois Infantry, charged into the crater, hoping to exploit the gap. But the Confederates, despite the shock of the explosion, quickly regrouped. Led by officers like Major Samuel Lockett, they poured musket fire and artillery into the crater, turning it into a death trap. The Union soldiers were forced to retreat, leaving behind many dead and wounded. The failure of this assault only reinforced Grant's decision to continue the siege and wait for the Confederates to exhaust their supplies. Before launching the siege, Grant made sure that all possible escape routes for the Confederate forces were sealed off. He ordered his engineers to construct a series of fortifications and earthworks around the city, creating a nearly impregnable ring of defenses. Union soldiers worked tirelessly, digging trenches, building gun emplacements, and preparing for the long siege ahead. John C. Pemberton was a man caught between two worlds. Born in Pennsylvania to a Northern family, he had chosen to fight for the South, a decision that weighed heavily on him throughout the war. His loyalty to his Southern wife and his adopted homeland led him to take a stand with the Confederacy, but it also meant that he faced suspicion and doubt from both his peers and his superiors. His decision to defend Vicksburg, the Confederacy's last major stronghold on the Mississippi, was fraught with internal conflict. Pemberton, a seasoned officer with experience in the Mexican-American War, knew the odds were stacked against him. His 30,000 men were outnumbered more than 2-1 by Grant's 77,000-strong Union army. Supplies were already dwindling before the siege began, and reinforcements were nowhere in sight. The Confederate High Command, including President Jefferson Davis and General Joseph E. Johnston, pressured him to hold Vicksburg at all costs, but Pemberton understood that the city's isolation and lack of resources made this a nearly impossible task. Pemberton was faced with an agonizing choice: surrender the city, a vital strategic point, and face the wrath of his superiors and the Southern populace, or hold out as long as possible, risking the lives of his men and the city's civilians. Grant had learned from earlier, failed frontal assaults that Vicksburg's defenses were too formidable for a quick victory. The city was protected by a series of earthen fortifications and natural defenses, making direct attacks costly and ineffective. Instead, Grant opted for a siege, a slow, methodical stranglehold designed to starve the city into submission. The Union Army dug in. Day and night, the sound of Union cannons echoed through the hills as the bombardment of the city began. The Union Navy, under Admiral David D. Porter, blockaded the Mississippi River, ensuring that no supplies could reach the besieged city. Inside Vicksburg, the conditions quickly deteriorated. The Confederate soldiers and civilians trapped within the city soon faced a grim reality. Food supplies dwindled, and the once thriving city became a place of desperation and misery. As the days turned into weeks, the siege of Vicksburg became a test of endurance for both soldiers and civilians. With food running out, the Confederate troops were reduced to eating whatever they could find. Mules, horses, and even rats became part of their diet. The civilian population, caught in the crossfire, sought refuge in caves dug into the hillsides. These makeshift shelters, known as bomb-proofs, offered some protection from the relentless Union bombardment, but they were dark, damp, and filled with fear. One of the many soldiers enduring these conditions was Private William H. Billy Mayberry of the 48th Mississippi Infantry. Before the war, Mayberry had been a farmer, living a simple life. Now he found himself living like an animal, burrowed into the ground to escape the shells raining down on the city. In a letter to his wife, he described the horror. "We live like animals, burrowed in the ground. The shells from the Yankees fall like rain, and every day we bury more of our own." For the civilians, life was equally harsh. Families huddled together in their caves, listening to the terrifying sound of artillery explosions and the cries of the wounded. Disease spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions, and with medical supplies scarce, even minor injuries could prove fatal. Morale was at an all-time low, and many began to wonder if they would survive the siege. On the other side of the lines, the Union soldiers were also enduring the hardships of war, but with a sense of purpose. They knew that capturing Vicksburg would be a decisive blow to the Confederacy. Sergeant John Wesley Ryder, a Union soldier from Illinois, recorded his thoughts in his diary. "Every shot we fire brings us closer to victory. But it's a grim business. The cries of the wounded and the stench of death are constant companions." For Grant and his men, the siege was a calculated strategy. The constant bombardment was meant to wear down the Confederate defenders, both physically and psychologically. The Union soldiers, many of whom were veterans of previous battles, understood that the siege would be a long and grueling process, but they were determined to see it through. Inside the besieged city, Pemberton repeatedly sent urgent messages to General Joseph E. Johnston, who was stationed with a relief force nearby. Pemberton pleaded for Johnston to attack Grant's army and break the siege, but Johnston hesitated. Fearful of confronting Grant's superior numbers, Johnston delayed, waiting for the right moment to strike, a moment that would never come. This hesitation would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the Vicksburg campaign. Many in the South would blame Johnston for the loss of Vicksburg, accusing him of abandoning Pemberton and the city's defenders in their time of need. By late June, the situation had become unbearable. The people of Vicksburg, both soldiers and civilians, were starving. The Confederate forces were exhausted, their morale shattered by the relentless bombardment and the lack of hope for relief. Pemberton, once resolute, now faced the grim reality that surrender was inevitable. As the 4th of July approached, Pemberton made the painful decision to seek terms of surrender. He knew that continuing to fight would only lead to more death and suffering for his men and the people of Vicksburg. On July 3, 1863, Pemberton made a difficult decision. Realizing that continued resistance would only lead to the senseless slaughter of his men, he sent a note to General Grant requesting a meeting to discuss terms of surrender. The two generals met under a white flag of truce in a grove of trees between the lines, near what is now known as the Surrender Interview Site. Grant, known for his policy of unconditional surrender, initially offered harsh terms. The Confederate soldiers would be taken as prisoners of war. Pemberton, desperate to secure better terms for his men, argued that they should be allowed to leave Vicksburg with honor, marching out with their weapons. After some negotiation, Grant relented slightly, agreeing to parole the Confederate soldiers instead of imprisoning them. This meant they could return home, provided they swore not to take up arms against the Union again. Pemberton accepted these terms, knowing it was the best he could get under the circumstances. His officers, including Brigadier General Stephen D. Lee, were relieved that their men would be spared imprisonment, but saddened by the loss of Vicksburg. On the morning of July 4, 1863, the Confederate soldiers in Vicksburg stacked their rifles, furled their flags, and marched out of their defenses. The Union soldiers watched as the once proud army of Vicksburg surrendered, their faces a mix of relief and respect for their defeated foes. General Grant, who had led his men through a grueling campaign, watched as the stars and stripes were raised over the city. Among the Confederate ranks, Private William Watson felt a deep sense of loss. He wrote in his diary, "We have fought with all we had, but it was not enough. Vicksburg has fallen, and with it, our hopes." For the Union soldiers, like Sergeant John Wesley Ryder, the victory was bittersweet. "We have won the day," he wrote, "but at what cost? The price of victory is steep, and the memories of this siege will haunt us all." The fall of Vicksburg, coupled with the Union victory at Gettysburg the day before, marked a turning point in the Civil War. The Mississippi River was now under Union control, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. General Pemberton would be criticized by some in the South for his decision to surrender, while Grant's reputation as a brilliant strategist was solidified. The siege of Vicksburg was over, but the scars it left on the men who fought there would last a lifetime.